that doesn't necessarily mean we would see fewer deaths, but we would certainly see a lot less of the virus circulating in the population. So I think that it's up to employers and employees alike to assess what is absolutely essential, and is it absolutely essential that somebody travels for work and works outside of the home, or is it not? And we all have to act in the absolute best interests of the country at the moment and try and minimise that contact where possible.
Okay, thank you. To Dr. Ellie now. And Sharon says she thinks she may have already had coronavirus in January, but still has symptoms now, like a cough and a temperature. Is that possible? And what do you think she should do?
Given that we're now at the beginning of April, it would be unusual for any viral infection to have continued for that length of time. So that would already be 3 months. So it's possible that she did have something in January and now she has something else. So with a fever and a cough, that could be coronavirus symptoms. So I would be isolating as per the government recommendations. And if she has any breathlessness or any difficulty with her breathing, any change in her breathing, she should be talking to her GP or using the online 111 scoring system or speaking to 111. But I think it's unlikely that she's had the same illness the whole way through since January.
Okay, thank you. Natalie, you now. Dee has asked, can you catch coronavirus more than once?
Well, this specific coronavirus, so COVID-19, that is unlikely, or certainly unlikely in a very short time frame. So you develop antibodies to the virus after you've been infected with it. So if it was a couple of months later, you shouldn't be infected with exactly the same type of coronavirus again. We don't know how long the antibodies last for at the moment, but there's a good estimate of at least 6 months to a year, and it may be longer than that. So certainly you shouldn't be able to contract COVID-19 twice in this same epidemic period.
Now, is that based on our dealings with other coronaviruses, or is it based on what we know about this one in the short time that it's been around?
That's based on what we know of in other coronaviruses, but particularly in SARS, because this virus is SARS-CoV-2, which basically it's very similar in its genetic makeup to SARS, but it hasn't been around long enough yet for us to know how long the antibodies can last. But obviously there will be data from China shortly that indicates whether people have antibodies to the virus who were known to be infected, and whether those antibodies have persisted for the few months since they were infected. But we're still trying to get an accurate test to measure antibodies at the moment. So they're all still in research trials.
Okay. Any idea when that's going to come out, just briefly?
In the next few weeks. They're trialling them already at the moment. So if the data is good, they'll be available in the next few weeks. Some countries have already rolled them out.
Okay. Natalie, thanks a lot. Dr. Ellie, Hugh wants to ask you, will COVID-19 behave like the winter flu and return at the end of the year? And could we have a vaccine by then?
So that goes back to the question Natalie just answered. So if it stays the same, then people will have immunity, should have immunity in the winter, so it won't be coming back. The reason that seasonal flu comes around each winter is because they're actually different viruses. So the flu jab that we use every year at the moment in the UK contains either 3 or 4 different viruses, whereas COVID-19 is one virus. So if it stays the same and it doesn't mutate and it doesn't change, then our immunity should carry on as Natalie's just described. In terms of the vaccine, I think the estimates are anywhere between 6 months to 18 months. We have to remember how much testing and regulation goes into vaccine and drug production. And the worst thing we could do is to rush out a vaccine before it's safe.
Okay, thank you so much. Don't go anywhere, because we're going to come back. You're watching Sky News. Lots more questions for Dr. Ellie and Natalie in a moment. See you then. Welcome back to our coronavirus Q&A here on Sky News. We've got Natalie McDermott, she's a clinical lecturer at King's College London, and Dr. Ellie Cannon, who's a GP. Thanks for holding on there for us. Another question to Natalie, and Mark Dunkley has asked, do we currently have sufficient oxygen supplies for the NHS and sufficient capacity in the supply chain to fulfil future needs? I suppose particularly pertinent because we just saw what happened at Watford Hospital.
So certainly at the moment, we have sufficient oxygen supplies for any patients who are admitted. I think where there may come a change is if we have an influx of even more patients requiring oxygen. And it's not that we don't have a sufficient supply, it's just that we might have to upscale the manufacturing process in the UK. And also it's sorting out the logistics of making sure more and more oxygen cylinders are reaching hospitals that need them, and also ensuring refilling of cylinders that are based at hospitals. So many hospitals will have a very large canister that supplies oxygen to the wards for anyone that needs it. And so it's just making sure that things are filled up regularly, and portable canisters are transported to hospitals as well in case supplies run low. And
one would assume that given what we're facing, that is being done. I mean, do we have any idea that it is?
My understanding is that that is one of the government's priorities. Certainly they have mentioned it in their news conferences in the last week, that they will ensure upscaling of ventilators, which we've heard of a delivery of 300 ventilators today. But a ventilator is only useful if you can also supply oxygen through it. You can ventilate with air, but many patients who are being ventilated may also require higher levels of oxygen. So that is a priority for the government. Where they are at with upscaling that, I'm afraid I can't comment.
OK, Natalie, thanks. Dr. Ellie, one for you. Someone on Twitter has asked, are people who smoke cigarettes and e-cigarettes at a greater risk of contracting the coronavirus than those who don't?
It's not so much about being at greater risk of getting the virus, because we're all at the same risk of contracting the virus. It's how ill you would get if you were a smoker or a vapor. I think it's hard to say with e-cigarettes because they've just not been around for long enough. And what we always say about e-cigarettes is they are less risky than smoking, but we don't know yet about their long-term risks, although all the evidence would point to the fact that they are much less risky than smoking, even in the long term. Certainly, if you are a smoker, your lungs are not as able to cope with infections as if you're not a smoker. You would be more likely to develop a pneumonia and a severe illness. So it is absolutely the time to quit now when we are social distancing.
OK, Dr. Lee, thanks. Natalie, Nick asks what I'm sure many people are asking. At what point could the government decide to extend the current lockdown and impose further restrictions?
So that's a very good question. I think that it will depend on what we're seeing in terms of the number of people infected, the number of hospital admissions, and the number of deaths. So the government are monitoring that. And if we see that the social distancing measures currently in place are having a good effect, then in due course the government might relax some of them. But if we see that actually it's taking longer for them to have an effect than we thought, it may be that the government feel the need to prolong the process. I think what's likely is that at some stage the measures are relaxed, but we may then see a surge in cases again, and the government may decide, actually, we need to go back to where we were. But the best way for us to shorten the amount of time that we are essentially in lockdown is for us to all abide by those measures and ensure that people are social distancing. And then we will see a decrease in numbers and hopefully eventually a decrease in deaths, and hopefully a relaxation of the lockdown measures.
Because it's all about the modelling, isn't it? Taking the figures that we have available now and looking at what they sort of forecast, as it were.
Yes, so it's all about trying to reduce the amount of people who have contact with one another in terms of the social distancing and the lockdown. The reason for doing that is to try and reduce the number of new infections we get from any one person who is infected. If we can bring that number below 1, so anyone who's infected with the virus infects less than one person, then we can eventually get on top of the epidemic. And that's what the modelling shows very clearly. And we will be guided by the modelling as to the impact of the social distancing measures so far. But the goal is to get that number of new cases or new infections from any one infected person to below 1.
Okay. Dr. Ellie, Natalie, thank you so much for talking to us this evening.